This is Creative Banter, a creativity and philosophy-focused podcast hosted by Cody Schultz and Ben Horn. Though we often avoid discussing gear, as there are already plenty of resources focused on the subject, we have been getting quite a few questions about how to start with large format. So we felt it was time to sit down and give our recommendations. Given this is such a large topic, we are splitting this episode into two. The first is all about the basics, including what cameras, lenses, and film we would recommend, as well as a few worthwhile tidbits of knowledge to pass along. In next week's episode, we will be discussing how we scan and organize our film, whether we have ever used digital medium format cameras, along with a few other questions sent in on the Discord from you, the listener. Let's dive right into it, shall we? So, large format today. All about gear and recommendations and a bunch of other questions that were sent in on the Discord from you, the listeners.
Yeah, all the fun stuff that people, because we know that people really love hearing gear talk.
Yes.
And so this is our special gift to those of you who enjoy gear talk, especially large format gear talk. But actually, in this case, we usually try to avoid talking technical stuff and gear stuff. But in the context of large format, we've had a lot of questions. People have been curious about it. And I think some of the discussions will extend beyond just the technical stuff and into perhaps how that influences the images one can shoot on large format. So we've got your questions, and we'll see if we can answer them.
Yeah, do the best that we can with them. And we've got quite a few, so we'll see how long it takes us to get through most of these. And there's always that potential of it turning into a 2-part episode. Maybe our first.
Yeah.
That'd be kind of cool. So
yeah, and I've got some little notes I wrote down, as well as some of the key points that I've learned through the years as well that could also facilitate some interesting discussions on the topic.
Yeah, cool. So may as well get started with it, with how to get started in large format, because obviously you can't really do anything with large format unless you have a camera, have your lenses, and have your film chosen. So when it comes to recommendations based on cameras, what would you recommend someone to dive into?
I guess one of the things with large format is it has a different process of working, and you don't really know how well you're going to embrace that until you've tried it.
Right.
I find that most of the people I know who have tried it, they have enjoyed the process and they kind of dig deeper into it. But the initial investment can certainly be
daunting,
a bit intimidating at first. What was the first large format camera you bought, Cody?
I bought the Intrepid 4x5. I think it was the Mark III. I bought that one mainly because I wanted something that was going to have a bit more functionality than like a Graflex would. And I wanted something that was new. I don't really understand that anymore as to why I would so heavily lean in towards a new camera, because at least personally I would recommend looking on the used market more so. But for some reason at that point I was very used to buying new gear, and so I wanted something new and shiny.
Yeah.
So I went with Intrepid just because the barrier to entry was very low.
Yeah, they're fairly inexpensive cameras. They're very similar to the other cameras that are out there in terms of it just being a light-proof box, but and also in the way that you work with them. And then I know that you ended up with a Chamonix.
Yes. Yeah, I'd switched over to Chamonix in 2020, or was it 2021? I can't remember exactly. Regardless, I switched over because I wanted a bit more functionality. The Intrepid, as great starter cameras as they are, I found it to lack in a couple different ways, and certain aspects were starting to fall apart on me because I'm not gentle with any of my cameras, and so I want it.
Neither are bears.
Yeah. To be honest, if I had that Intrepid in the bag instead of the Chamonix, I wouldn't have a 4x5 right now, just because I know it would have gotten completely destroyed by that bear.
Yeah.
But yeah, I switched over to Chamonix just because I wanted a few more little features. It had better bellows extension, better like when you're going to use tilt, it has the clicks, so it helps you to reset everything properly. And Intrepid has since introduced those into, what are they, the Mark IV or Mark V? So Intrepid's continuing to get better, but there's also the aesthetic side of the Chamonix. I mean, you pull that camera out and everybody around you, if there's anyone at all kind of like oogles over it a little bit. So
yeah, and that's the thing. I think when people are coming from digital, where you have, cameras are differentiated based on the resolution, the feature set, the focus abilities, all that kind of stuff. When you move to large format, the camera is basically just a light-proof box. And in many ways, you can look at, for example, if you look at the 8x10s, like an Intrepid 8x10, I don't know what they're going for right now, like $600, somewhere in
like
about that
yeah.
range. And it is basically a light-proof box. You put a lens on one side, you put a film holder on the other side, and so long as it's light-proof and so long as it, holds the lens and holds the film holder and doesn't really get in the way of the process of making an image, it's really not going to be that much different than a camera that can be a lot more expensive. So earlier this year, I purchased a Chamonix Alpinist X, and it's still an 8x10 camera. It weighs a very similar amount to the Intrepid, but it's about a $6,000 camera.
Yeah.
And this would seem absolutely absurd, I think, for most anyone just looking at that. Like, how is a light-proof box that costs 10 times as much, how is it worthwhile? What's the difference there? And a lot of it comes down to just the fact that it is a little bit easier to work with. It gets in the way a little bit less.
A little bit more refined.
A little more refined.
Lighter weight for at least a lot of them.
Though in this case, it's actually a little bit heavier, just a little bit heavier than the Intrepid, but they're pretty similar.
Right.
But basically, no matter what camera you're working with, basically it comes down to you want that camera to essentially disappear in your hands. You don't want to be thinking about using it. You just want to reach for things. You want to do things. You don't want, just as if you're playing an instrument, and this is a music analogy coming from a person who doesn't play any instruments, but from what I understand, if you play an instrument, you want to be one with that instrument. You don't want to have it get in the way for one reason or another.
And you can say the same thing with digital too. I mean, with film, the only thing that you're taking away is the megapixel, the resolution race that everybody is a part of. You take that away and it's the same thing. It's a light, tight box that you want it to do its job as smoothly as possible and forget that you were even using it. You don't want to have to think about anything. That's why so many people will switch from one brand of camera to the next or stick with a brand of camera for their lifetime, even if other brands are refining things in a better way, just because of menu systems, because that camera like the back of your hand. And so that's it's the same principles.
Yeah. And when conditions are changing quickly, when you have to set up a photo quickly, these are the things where you don't think about, you don't want the camera to get in the way. You just want to be able to work with it and just have a very smooth process. And that's actually one of the reasons why I've switched to the Chamonix over my Arca Swiss even as my primary camera now, just because it just gets the job done with very little thought in mind. But when a person's getting into it, if they're starting out fresh, it makes no real sense to spend, whether it's $6,000 or $3,000 on a camera that you may not necessarily even find yourself using. Maybe the format isn't right for you.
Even for me, wanting to go to 8x10 or contemplating it, I'm not looking at the Alpinist at any point.
Yeah,
I'm not looking to drop $6,000 on a camera just yet without knowing that, oh yeah, the 8x10 is going to give me more of what I want from this format. So instead, I'm looking more towards either the used market or Intrepid, because like you said, it doesn't make sense to. That's a lot of film. I mean, it is so much more film that you could buy. That's a ton of lenses. You could kit yourself all out and still have a ton of money left over for $6,000 if you go the cheaper route, if you're a little bit more fiscal with your money.
And so I would definitely say take a look at Intrepid for those that are starting out. Take a look at the used market. And you mentioned earlier about how you were really looking for a new camera. And I would say that there is some importance to that. Not necessarily that it's new, but that it's made by a camera manufacturer that is still around.
Yeah.
From the standpoint that you can still get spare parts for them. I've had like screws strip out on cameras I've had, and when you can just call up the manufacturer and get the spare parts and you're up and running, there is something to be said about that. So I am a big fan of Intrepid. It may be all the camera you ever need, though if you do outgrow it, you'll know why you outgrew it, and that might help you to go down some other road, whatever road that may be, which is going to be a much more expensive road.
I mean, Alex Burke used the Intrepid, I think the Mark II, since Intrepid had released it for 4 or 5 years before switching to a Chamonix. And even at that point, it wasn't necessarily because of it being not light enough or there being a ton of refinements. He just, at that point, the camera was on its deathbed. He needed something better. So you shouldn't have to or feel as though you have to shy away from Intrepid or really any camera brand in particular. For me, if I were starting over again, I would definitely look at Intrepid, or I know I had said Graflex before, but I meant to say Crown Graphic is another more popular used market camera. There are a ton of them out there, and you can spend $500, $600, $1,000 at the top end on a used whole kit that comes with everything that you would need to get started. Yeah. The other thing to consider, though, when you were talking about getting into large format, and I had someone email me a few months ago when we were first starting this, asking about it. I highly recommend, if you have not already, to start out with medium format instead of large format. And I don't know how you feel about this one, Ben, but especially with the price of everything large format going up and just film in general going up, if you're not used to working with film, it's a very different process than with digital, or at least it can be. And so you could save a lot of money by getting into medium format first and then deciding a little bit down the line, this is something that I want to stick with, and then jumping into large format.
See, I worked with a little bit with medium format. I didn't use it as a stepping stone to go to large format. Though I will say that in the notes I wrote down here, one of the most significant learning curves to switching to large format from digital is learning how to meter a scene and learning how to use a light meter. And if you work with a medium format camera that does not have a built-in light meter, where you have to use a external spot meter, that will help you with the learning curve. Though I will say that when it comes to working with large format, I think the other big learning curve is all the muscle memory that's involved in terms of working with the camera. And that's certainly something that working with a medium format first will not really help with. Because you have to sort of build up your own little OCD sort of techniques in order to make sure that you don't mess anything up. And large format is actually inherently simple. I think working a large format camera is more simple than working a medium format camera, because the medium format cameras all have their own particular ways when it comes to loading the film and advancing things and all kinds of stuff like that. It's not that they're hard to use, but large format is inherently simpler, though there are so many more ways to mess up a photo with large format, such as like leaving the shutter open when you put a film holder in and pull the dark slide. You just fry that sheet of film, and there's no real warning against that. So I've developed a sort of an OCD thing where I will trip the shutter before pulling the dark slide, because the shutter won't trip unless the shutter is closed. So little techniques like that you learn with time. And you're very right that mistakes will be less expensive by working with a medium format camera, but even those cameras get to be kind of expensive now.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's a tough one.
It is. I mean, the biggest benefit to going medium format before large format, at least how I see it, is a lot of medium formats cameras, they, at least in general, feel very similar to what you're working with, especially if you go with like a Pentax 6.7 or...
That's true.
So the learning curve isn't quite as steep. Even though large format is quite simple, it is very intimidating for a lot of people. And so...
It is.
Especially when you go from digital straight into large format. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I just, from my personal experience, I went from digital to 35, then to medium format, then up to large format. And so it worked for me, but it might not work for everyone else, and that might not be the path that everyone else wants to take.
Exactly. It'll be different for each person. I'm kind of more of a trial by fire kind of person, where I went from digital to 4x5 with Velvia 50, which is one of the more tricky films to shoot.
Don't do that,
because you got to get it like perfect.
Yeah. Everyone listening, don't fall.
Then within like a few months, within a few months, I jumped up to 8x10, still with Velvia. But I think that, there was a bit of a learning curve, but at the same time, I was able to figure things out pretty fast, and there was no real surprises there. But also, I kind of knew that that's where I wanted to be, and I think with a lot of people, they'll probably dabble into different formats, see how they like it. Whereas I kind of knew that right away that's where I wanted to go with things.
Now, would you recommend people to start off with 4x5 before going 8x10, or just
8x10 is kind of insane.
Yeah.
A 4x5 is honestly all a person really needs. Everything is more reasonable. The cost of the film, the cost of the processing, the size of the equipment. I would not, unless you know that, kind of like what I was thinking when I was getting into it, that 8x10 is ultimately where I want to be. But even then, I did 4x5 first. Found I really liked it and jumped up to 8x10. But I think if you jump straight to 8x10, it takes a special kind of crazy for that, which I admire and I relate to. But it honestly is overkill for the vast majority of things. So I wouldn't necessarily jump right to 8x10. I think that's a little out there.
Now, what about lens recommendations? What lens would, if someone only had the budget for one camera, say they pick an Intrepid, and they only have enough money left over to have one lens, what lens would you recommend?
So for the longest time, I've said a normal lens, and I still stand by that. When I was shooting digital, I think this is one of the things that can seem a little bit strange at first for a person who's shooting digital when they're looking at large format is that the normal lens is actually a very powerful lens on large format. It's good for close-up work. It lends itself to the format because whereas with digital, people oftentimes use a long lens or use a wide lens, at least for landscapes, to get a perspective different from what you just normally see, because they're looking for something that is going to give them a photo that, I don't know, with a long lens, you can kind of pick out details at a distance. With a wide angle lens, you can show the grand landscape. And those lenses really dominate for digital. But for large format, typically you're going to recognize a subject with your eyes before you pull the camera out and look through the viewfinder. And as a result, a normal lens is often going to be your best friend, because if you see something that looks really good with your eyes, chances are you can find a very good effective composition for it with a normal lens.
And when you say normal lens, we're talking like 40 to 60 millimeter focal length equivalent.
Yeah. No, yeah.
So on large format.
And so on a 4x5, that's around like a 150 or so, maybe a little bit less than a 150, but in about that range. On 8x10, it's about a 300. Right. And so those lenses, just because of the way that you work with large format, those lenses are the ones where you see something, you throw a normal lens on there, you can frame it up. Ultra wide angle lenses are a little bit trickier for large format, just from the standpoint that you don't really know how it's going to look until you look through the viewfinder, which takes some time to do. And long lenses are tough to come by for large format just because of the way the cameras work out. So I would say a normal lens is a great way to start. It may be all the lens you ever need. Though I will say that lately I've shifted to a 2-lens approach mostly, which is one a little bit wider than a normal lens and one that's a little bit longer than a normal lens. I find the two of those work pretty well. But what lens do you have, Cody?
I am strictly using a 210 millimeter lens, which is about 60, 70 millimeter equivalent, somewhere in that range, depending on how you divvy it up.
Yeah.
I've found that is the only lens that I really ever need. Like you were saying, a lot of my photography, when I'm walking along the woods, I see a scene with my eyes, obviously. And be kind of weird if I saw it with something else.
Yeah. I saw it with my
finger.
Ears.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, I can't really make fun of that because blind people kind of see with their fingers. But anyway, besides the point.
That's true.
So,
yeah,
walking along the woods and you see a scene and it's just, you get to a point where that's kind of what you want to compose, what you see.
Yeah.
So I've found that normal lens range has really worked out well for me. I'm a little bit more telephoto than a traditional normal lens, traditional 150.
Yeah.
I've thought about getting a 90 millimeter, so about a 30 millimeter equivalent. But I don't know. Right now I'm very content with what I have, and it's been and the 50 millimeter range has been pretty much where I've stuck for 4 or 5 years, even back when I was shooting with digital. And so I'm very comfortable with that focal length. So I think that's the biggest thing that you could do is to find a focal length that you are comfortable with now. Like if you're shooting on digital primarily right now, go back through your catalog of images, whether that's on Lightroom or otherwise. And at least in Lightroom, I know there's a way to see your images, I think, ranked by the focal length that you have, and just see which ones, how many photographs are taken with each lens, and then go for that lens if you only have the budget for a single lens. One thing that I did find that was really kind of odd was when I first started off, I also had the 75 millimeter lens, which is about, 24?
It's a really wide.
Yeah, 24 millimeter equivalent, 20 millimeter equivalent. Wide lenses look super, super wide on 4x5, on 8x10. I think it has something to do with the fact that you're looking at ground glass. So you're looking at a 4x5 inch rectangle instead of this little tiny LCD or through the viewfinder.
Mm-hmm.
And so you perceive every focal length as being a bit wider than what it really is. So that's something that really tripped me up because I had worked with like a 24 mil equivalent on digital, and I was like, oh, yeah, I've done this. I have some photos in my collection that like this, so I'll go with that. And yeah, that was weird, and I didn't like it.
Yeah. And that also speaks to something when you're talking about going through like your Lightroom library, look at the focal lengths of what you use most. It's also important to know that if you do go to a different format like large format, your choice of subjects may very well be different than what you're working with digital. And so even though your most commonly used focal lengths on digital, you might be familiar with those with that format. When you go to large format, you might find that you have a different sort of subject choice, which typically does result in focal lengths closer to the normal range. And just like you're saying, a 210 is a slightly longer than normal. That's very similar to one of my most commonly used lenses on 8x10, which is a 450. And for those doing the math at home, you take a focal length on 8x10, you cut it in half, and that's the equivalent in 4x5. So a 450 is pretty close to a 210. Yeah. But I use a 450 and a 240 as my like primary lenses. But if I had to have just one, it probably would just be for me a 300, which is just in the normal range. It's a pretty versatile lens. Another thing too, when it comes to lenses, and this is one of the really cool things about large format, if you're coming from digital, where you end up spending thousands and thousands of dollars on a lens to try to get one that has very little issues with like color fringing and all kinds of like stuff that happens. With large format, the lenses are not very expensive. They're all going to be used. But I mean, you're looking at, a few $100s maybe for a 4x5 lens. But that lens, you're not going to have the optical issues you have on a digital system, because the final image, so your 4x5 inch transparency or black or negative, it's enlarged very little to get to your final print size. And since we don't enlarge things dramatically like it happens on digital, the lens flaws aren't enlarged. So basically, for a few $100, you can get a lens that is significantly smaller and lighter than the lenses you'd use on a digital kit, but without all the flaws that come with them. So it can be a little bit strange to think of coming from a digital kit where you spend thousands of dollars on a lens and it's still not a, quote, perfect lens, to go to spending, $300 on a lens and find that optically it's spot on without really any issues at all. And so that's one of the nice things. And also the lenses are very small and compact compared to on digital, to the point where you can get a 4x5 kit with a camera and lens that perhaps, it could be similar size and weight to maybe a digital kit, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, that definitely makes it a lot more friendly when you're backpacking and everything, and it's friendlier on the budget too. I mean, most 4x5 lenses are typically in like the $300 to $600 range. There's obviously more expensive ones. Certain, I think, Schneiders are quite expensive depending on when they were manufactured, the different glass that we used, the coatings on that glass. So you can certainly get up there in price when it comes to certain lenses that you want, even with 4x5 and especially with 8x10. But for someone just starting out too, and even for like me, it's very easy to pick up a lens off eBay or Facebook Marketplace or wherever for $500. That's typically, I think, like your average for a lens. And that lens, it may be 40, 50 years old, but it'll outshine any of your digital lenses.
And they appreciate in value.
Yes.
Which is crazy.
Yeah, you're not going to see that with digital. unless you're Leica.
No, like there's one lens I have. I paid maybe $1,500 for it. I don't know, 5-6 years ago. They sell routinely on eBay for $5,000 now. It's insane. It makes no sense. But that's the other thing too. If you are thinking about trying to get into large format to try it out, you can basically buy the equipment used, use it for a while, and if it just isn't your thing, you can sell it for probably at least what you paid for it. And in some cases, maybe it'll go up a little bit in value too. So, if you are at all curious, it's something where it doesn't really hurt to try. The other thing that comes to mind as something that's very important to have when getting into it is a light meter.
Yes.
What do you use, Cody?
I just use the Pentax spot meter for mine. They have a digital version as well that's a little bit newer. Some of them are modified for the zone system, which if you are shooting black and white and you really want to delve into the technical, then that might be beneficial for you. But I've been happy with my old thing. I mean, I think I paid $150 for it on the used, and I ended up having to buy another one, and I actually want to see about fixing up the old one that I have, so I have a backup. But I've also been considering the Reveni Labs, their new little real tiny thing that they have.
Yeah. And when it comes to meters, those who shoot black and white oftentimes really prefer the Pentax spot meters. Just the way that they operate are very user-friendly for shooting black and white. Since I shoot color transparency film, the Sekonic meters are, in my opinion, a bit easier for that sort of workflow. I think a lot of it has to do with, for black and white, you're metering the shadows, and that's just the Pentax meters are very simple for doing that. When working with color transparency film, you need to be careful of your highlights and your shadows. And with the Sekonic meters, you can very quickly see how bright and dark your shadows and highlights are, just to make sure that they're within the range of what the film can do. And so I actually have both meters. I have the Pentax and I also have the Sekonic. The Sekonic is my go-to meter. So it's a Sekonic spot meter. The 500 series and the 700 series meters, which are, you'll only find them used. They're not made anymore. Very, very good meters. Their current one, I'm not a big fan of because it has like this big color touch screen on it, which when I worked at the camera store, I took one of them outside and it was kind of hard to read outside. So I prefer the 500 and 700 series from Sekonic, but the meter will be your best friend. You need to, that's like one of your biggest learning curves, is to learn how to meter your film, especially if you're working with transparency film, it's extra important. If you're working with black and white film, it gives you the ability to get kind of fancy and know how to do the processing for the film and such to get the most out of it. But I remember the first time I went out to shoot a photo, I had my light meter in hand. I had my camera set up my composition, which is easy to do, put my film holder in there, and then I realized I have no clue how to use a light meter. So, and it's not hard to do. It just takes a little bit of time. But once you get proficient with a light meter to the point where you don't think about it, you just hit buttons and do things and get your meter reading, that's when large format becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, if I would recommend anyone or anything to anyone, I would actually say, even if you are using transparency film, you can pick up the Pentax spot meter for around $200 or so, or the new Reveni Labs spot meter, I think is right around that price. But on top of that, I would also recommend taking a course on metering. There's a bunch of online courses that are available that could be really beneficial if you're just figuring things out. I know Nick Carver has one that I can highly recommend. I took it and it completely changed the way that I meter my photographs. And I went from majorly overexposing a lot of my scenes just because of not properly aligning everything, to now I come out with negatives that look just about exactly how I want them to, which really helped to stomp down that learning curve.
Yeah, and I know that his course is greatly geared towards the pentax meters,
Yes.
if I'm not mistaken. I know he's not as huge of a fan of the Seiconics, but also I think a lot of that's because he's working a bit more with negative film, whether it's black and white or color, which is a little bit of a different approach than transparency film. And because basically when you work with the Seiconic meters, you can very quickly see exactly how bright your highlights are and how dark your shadows are without having to do any math in your head. And for me, that is quite beneficial.
Yeah, it all depends on what like with anything, what your goals are, what you have in mind for what you want to do. And also how much money you want to allot to getting started with this. Because,
for sure.
like I said, you could get a kit for $500, or you could go all out and get a kit for $5,000. It all depends. But mention a little bit on film, but what film would you recommend people to start off with?
That's a tough one. There are so many options out there. As I mentioned earlier, I did the trial by fire of learning on transparency film, which makes you very good at metering at that point in time, because if you're off by a little bit, you will notice it. Some people said start with black and white because that way, you kind of ease into it. But also, since you don't see, like if your exposure is a little bit different from one photo to the next, it's hard to even really notice that. Whereas you do with transparency film. I say really pick the film based on the aesthetic of what you're going for, whether it's a matter of, if there's pictures you've seen people post on social media and you just like the look of that, whether it's with color negative film or black and white or transparency film. But I'll say pick one film and get to know that film. Spend a lot of time with that film, use that film in different situations. I think if you jump from one film to the next, it might rob you of the process of learning how that film is going to react in the different situations. So it's hard to say which one to start out with, other than follow your curiosity. And if there's something that looks a bit like what you want to achieve, maybe try that out. For me, Provia from Fuji is like my go-to film for most things. But it's also because I know how that film is going to react in most situations, and it gets the job done for what I want to do. But it's if you're shooting a different type of subject where you want a different aesthetic, Provia is maybe not the right choice for you.
Yeah, and even with individual film types, so like you have your transparency, then you have your negative films, both in color and in black and white. There's differences between each film itself within those. So like with black and white, you may pick up, say you get a box of Ilford FP4+, which is primarily what I use. If you take a couple photographs with that and then you decide, I'm going to switch over to Delta, which is still right around a 100 ISO film, your photographs are going to look a little different, even if you're developing at home. So each film has their own characteristics, and so it's a matter of really stick with one film type, with one film in general, for a couple months and see where that takes you. If you are on social media and you see, I really like Portra, because a lot of people tend to like using Portra films, try it out. See what happens and see if you can get the look that you want. Don't get so easily discouraged just because you can't immediately make the film respond how you want it to. Yeah, and just stick it out and see how it goes. Don't go switching every other week just because you're not getting exactly what you want just yet. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
big learning curve to this, and you have to be ready for that every step of the way.
And I have this similar sort of approach to printing. So there's like one paper I use for the vast majority of my printing, because I know how that paper is going to respond. I know how it's going to hold the shadows. I know how the color is going to be. I really like the way that paper performs. So, I stick with that paper a lot, versus if I were to print on different papers, that same image is going to look a bit different. So it really is a matter of finding what sort of aesthetic you're going for. And also it's a sort of thing where you don't really know when you're getting into it. You don't really know. There's so many things that you don't realize you don't know. Like when you set up a particular photo of something, so I think it's fascinating just to see how the film will render a scene. And it could be definitely a little bit of a surprise at first, but you learn from that. And if there's something that doesn't turn out quite the way you want, and at that point, perhaps you can experiment with some other films that maybe do that particular thing a little bit better. Like for what I do, shooting a lot of subjects in reflected light and soft light and canyons and such, I find what films work really well for that, and I'm just sticking to that. I have no real desire to try anything different. So I just as you're saying, keep it simple with the film stocks at first, and spend some time with that film getting to know it. I hope you enjoyed our creative banter. You can learn more about Cody's work by visiting his website, codyschultz.com. And you can find my work at benhorn.com. For further discussion, join us at patreon.com/creativebanter. It's a place where we can interact with you, the listener. And although we greatly appreciate those who contribute by joining a tier, discussions are open to everyone, whether you're a paying member or not. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you around next time.